So I'm really delighted to welcome Dawn Nafus, who's arrived here from the US. And Dawn is going to be talking to us about getting out of the clouds, something we've been really looking forward to. We're particularly interested in Dawn's work, particularly in relation to her work on self-tracking and her other work around data and technology. So we're really, really pleased to have her here. Now, Dawn is a senior research scientist at Intel Labs, which is part of Intel's research capacity. And Dawn's recently published 2 books, which are of particular interest to us, and I'm sure that several people here have been reading, might have some questions about as well. Her book called Quantified, Biosensing in Everyday Life, and another book called Self-Tracking, which is an authored book with Gina Neff, and they're both at MIT Press. So welcome, Dawn. Fantastic to have you here, and I'll hand over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Sarah, and to the Center for inviting me, and to you all sort of valiantly spending your time in a seminar room when I realize there is summer to get on with. Much appreciated. So I'll confess that the talk has changed since the title was set, so I won't talk a whole lot about cloud computing, but you can infer from the title that I'm much more interested in concreteness than cloudiness. So there's that. As Sarah's introduction alluded to, I've been working with the Quantified Self community for a number of years now, and by working with, I actually mean a couple of different roles. It started out as an effort to do ethnography of that movement, because I'm at Intel. That was for a particular reason, and that we wanted to know what we could build for self-trackers, and so I ended up getting stuck into the design of a tool for that purpose far more deeply than I expected. So I'll sort of be talking a bit as a designer as well, although I don't claim any design expertise necessarily. And then finally, as a participant as well. As an ethnographer, I take participation fairly seriously, and you'll hear some of that as well. So for those of you who don't know a whole lot about QS, this is a group of people, it's Quantified Self, QS for short, and they're a group of people who are enthusiastic about keeping track of their bodies in some way, right? So that could be keeping handwritten logs, spreadsheets, or using any number of the sensors that are now available. And some even go further than that. They'll do sort of testing of the blood, of microbiome, saliva, outside of a clinical setting. But what's really most important is not necessarily what they keep track of, because that changes all the time, but the fact that this is a real community, right? So this really is not sort of anyone and everyone who's ever owned a fitness tracker, right? This is a group of people who get together and talk about what they've found, right? What they're learning, what they're keeping track of, and what that means. Right, so in some ways, this is a group that's quite elite. It's a group that has its roots in Silicon Valley. It skews white and male, although I will say less male than other technical communities I've been involved in. But it also, in other ways, kind of plays the role of the subaltern to other much more powerful institutions like medicine and technical development, right? And so what I'm going to try to do today is to use those 3 different positionalities to think through the social and cultural politics of data aggregation, right? So the allusion to the cloud in the title is really about, how can we think more concretely about data aggregation than it just sits in some cloud somewhere. Now, often when we think about aggregation, right, the first thing that comes to our minds is sort of, gigantic stockpiles, right? Either housed by Google, the NSA, or, the state security, like whatever, those types of gigantic aggregations. And plenty of people have, of course, pointed out why we should be afraid of that and try to resist that. In this talk, I'm going to be less interested in that and more interested in sort of following individual data points sort of a little bit more slowly as they sort of accrue into a data set of a kind. And when we do that, what I think we get is we get to see multiple kinds of politics that start to happen, different kinds of social imaginations, different kinds of epistemics. And so in looking at these aggregations, I'm going to draw a distinction. I'm going to draw a distinction between pools of data that happen and essentially accrue within one person, and pools of data that are cross-population, right, across people. And so it sounds odd, right, to talk about a pool of data for one person. Come on in. Go to the other side so it's balanced. Thanks. No worries. Okay, so, so there's something strange that's happened in the last 10 years, right, with the proliferation of sensors and so forth. All of a sudden, we can start to talk credibly, for maybe not the first time, but certainly more robustly, about, data that refers to one person, but across different data types, right, in different time periods, in different locations, right, from different sources, right? So all of that is an aggregation of a kind. And of course, aggregations across people can be done in various ways too. And so my main argument here is going to be that QS really calls attention to a particular scalar move that I think is different from, but also until very recently, largely invisible to, sort of clinical approaches to big data. Approaches which very much privilege, creating a bird's eye view, right, of a population, right? And in STS, of course, we would recognize that as God trickery, right? But instead, right, we do have notions of scale within QS, and I think that opens up space for sort of broader contestation over who gets to define problems of the body and how. And that's at once political and epistemic, right? It's political in the sense that, there's been this long history of, medical movements, patient movements, sort of feminist interventions into clinical practice, right? People have had a say in what medicine does for a long time, but QS does it differently, right? It does it through data, and particularly continuously created sort of sensor data, right? But it also matters, I think, epistemologically, and that's where things get a little bit more tricky, right? So if you look at the work of Rob Kitchen, who sort of, reflects on big data very broadly, in the sort of the 2014 paper in Big Data and Society, he starts to explore, right, what does big data actually mean for scientific production, right? So not so much what is it businesses do, right, but for science, social science, and the humanities. And what he says is actually we're not yet having the right discussion, right? That a lot of the discussion is basically replicated kind of the two cultures model of how science operates. And really, there's a lot more room for situated reflexivity, contextually nuanced epistemology, right? The idea that you might, glue together both deduction and induction, who knew, right? And actually, that's the kind of stuff that big data, enables, and yet we're kind of not necessarily talking about it. And so, some of this paper is really going to be about trying to show that some of that is actually happening in QS already. Just, of course, outside the academy, but in some relation to it. And I'll try to develop that specifically through, reflecting on the work that went into building this data infrastructure effort, which is a tool called DataSense, which is still in beta. It's online and mostly operational, depending on what feature you try. And that effort really was an effort that started out trying to support intra-individual aggregation, and right now we're trying to grapple with what is this relationship with large N ways of knowing, right? And so that's as a tool, as a product with a social life. That may or may not sort of shake out, but what we learned in trying to wrestle with that, I think surfaces the challenges that arise when we try to take these differences really seriously. Right. So in terms of QS itself, there's been a lot of scholarship on QS that helps us think about it in many ways, right? So lots of people talk about it in terms of a form of biopolitics. Others talk about it as a kind of embodied way of doing mindfulness. We have Mina Ruckenstein in the room who talks about self-tracking and this notion of a data double, right, as a kind of a resource with which people might reflect on themselves and their lives. But in this talk, I'm going to talk about QS as specifically scientific knowledge producers, right, as people who have something to say to scientists, even if they don't necessarily identify that way. Here's my tea. So to do that, I'm going to turn to Dana Greenfield, who wrote a really excellent paper for our edited volume. And she raises this idea of quantified self as a paraclinical practice, meaning that community members appropriate tools of clinical practice, but they do that for their own ends, right? So she sort of draws connections to kind of the moves that, sort of earlier feminists did, right, with sort of the tools of reproduction. And so for a self-tracker in QS, what counts as relevant data happens through a specific frame, right? It happens, what's relevant is really only what's relevant to a personal health issue. And that's really a function of context. And sometimes they take into account what evidence-based medicine has to say, and sometimes they don't. And that's not a problem, right? I should be very clear about that. But then we can contrast that with evidence-based medicine, which constitutes data differently, right? It constitutes it as a function of what's knowable by reference to a large population, right? So that's how relevant data is made there, right? They're seeking generalizability. That generalizability is abstracted from any life as it's actually lived. And then you have this funny thing called precision medicine, which is just emerging. And precision medicine is this thing where there's really this push to kind of customize medical treatments based on a number of factors, right? The most mature version of this is through genomics. Increasingly, it's happening through exposome, right? Sort of environmental exposures, microbiome, right? And so what they're doing really is they're expanding the volume of data that refers specifically to an individual, but they're always doing it through reference to a general population, right? That's the scalar move that they're making. And so particularly in the popular press, right, quantified self and personalized medicine get talked about as if it's the same thing. But actually, the epistemologies through which they create their person-level aggregations are actually radically different, right? Precision medicine knows what it knows through generality, and self-trackers, on the other hand, are really much more circumspect to the, in their relationship with other people's data. But they do have a relationship, and that's what I'm going to come to at the end. Right, so this data sense effort that I keep talking about really started out as an effort to support the work of paraclinical practice, right? What people actually do in order to conduct essentially paraclinical research on themselves. So a good example of what this looks like, because I wanted to get you a feel for what the work is from Anne Wright, and I hope you will forgive the recursion of a white woman giving a talk about a white woman giving a talk. Right, so Anne she's this former NASA roboticist, and she's a roboticist who grew, at one point, while working for NASA, grows too sick to work. And so she found herself in this really difficult position of having what Joe Dumick calls an illness you have to fight to get, meaning that her particular bodily state really didn't fit established diagnostic categories. And so then there's this question of what do you do? Because, of course, medicine can't recognize what's not already a category in the system, right? That's a problem. And so she kind of went round and round around to specialist and ended up getting a kind of a diagnosis of, last resort. That basically acknowledged that, yes, we recognize that you have a problem, we know you're not making it up, but we have no idea what the cause is or what the solution is. And so she turns to self-tracking. You can see kind of in this picture the various things she tries to track, diet, sleep, activity, kind of a usual lineup in a way. But the way she frames it is she talks about herself as debugging a problem. And I think that's actually significant here, right? So she talks about how when she was working on the Mars rovers, right, there's actually no instructions for fixing a rover, right? It's not a refrigerator where you get the manual. And so when something goes wrong, right, you have to develop this instinct for how to, figure out what the cause is. And so that's the instincts that she's mobilizing here. And so roughly her process is, develop a loose sense for what's going on, collect some evidence, to sort of see if maybe that shakes out, reflect on it in relation to her body, right, which actually in some other work from Joe Dummett sort of says actually sort of bodily experience is perhaps more of a element of scientific production than the scientists like to sort of admit. And right, so when she adjusts, right, this is iteration. For those of you who do design, this is like straight up iteration, right? Right, and so, in some sense, again, I'll bring this back to kitchen, right? This sort of looks a whole lot like the kinds of, critical reflexivity that kitchen is calling for in big data work. Right, and so what's interesting is that in other ways, right, what Anne does is also remarkably ordinary, right? This is a woman who, as a former actual rocket scientist, has every single conceivable trick of math at her disposal, and she uses basically none of it, right? She's making, very deliberate choices about her data that will enable her to situate it in context best, right? So for example, she's taking a picture of everything she ate. Right, another way to do that, of course, would have been to write down calories, proteins, micronutrients, yada, yada, which would have enabled her to kind of, essentially do better math, because you can't do math on a picture. But the picture evokes context, right? And that, in a sense, gives her more interpretive flexibility, right? And so that's the technique, right? She talks about data as a way to pay attention, not as a way to render scientific. And of course, stuff like this is never going to be commensurate with the sorts of data that would be produced in a clinical setting, right? Right. The whole point is that her issue is already incommensurate, right, with those diagnostic categories. So eventually, because you might be curious what the resolution was, she worked out. I mean, I think. I'm trying to remember how long it took. Somewhere, more than 6 months, maybe less than a year. I mean, this was a real project for her. But she eventually figured out that it was vegetables in the nightshade family, so tomatoes, potatoes, that kind of thing, that was giving her this debilitating condition, and truly debilitating. She had to stop work. And so the solution is non-medical, right? Don't eat a tomato. Right, and so she's taking this very real medical issue, right, and the solution is to not eat a tomato. Who knew? Right. So in her case, right, she's working with both symptoms and possible causes, and both of those are encoded in the data in one way or another, sometimes loosely, sometimes not. But in a lot of self-tracking, the data actually only evokes something else, something that's actually not being measured directly, but also something that the person themselves probably know something about. And so I'm going to give you another case of John. I have an example of what his data might as well have looked like, but this is not his data. And so John is a QS member who was having trouble sleeping. And so he turns to this consumer-grade device, sort of a earlier one than contemporary Fitbits. And after sort of, a short stint of sensing, maybe about a month or two, he figures out that he was partially waking up at 3 a.m. precisely, right? And this was the visual technique he did. So we put night, 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 right, on each in a row. And so that was kind of suspicious to him, right? Because bodies are not that regular, like at precisely 3 a.m. And so he did some digging around and eventually worked out that his computer, which sat in his bedroom in the corner, was actually set to back itself up at 3 a.m. So you've got these hard drives whirring and a little light coming on, and he doesn't quite, he's not waking up enough to know that that's what it is, right? So, by listening to people like John and like Anne, one of the things that the data sense team sort of came to believe is that actually data, contrary to the Silicon Valley rhetoric, really isn't about delivering answers at all, right? Data is really about delivering clues, clues to something that lies just beyond the data, right? So then our design question became really, how do you support the finding of clues when all the relevant factors might not actually, we as designers might not know what the relevant factors are in the data itself because it's outside. And so for that, I began to use, trying to think about this anthropologically, I began to use Andrea Ballesteros' notion of a hinge. And when she talks about a hinge, what she means is that there are sort of material and semiotic qualities of data that make it possible to draw connections outside of the data itself, right? And there are better hinges and there are worse hinges, right? A pile of data in a spreadsheet probably doesn't contain very good hinges, although sometimes it might if you have a gigantic number in the middle of zeros, right? That's going to tell you something. But a data set, parsed, visualized, somewhere where you can see the highs and lows, timing, whatever it is. And here I want to be very clear that this is not just about visualization, right? That, even just one reading itself, right, if it evokes something, right, the semiotics matter as well as the visual, right, is kind of where I'm going with that. But still, you have to have some configuration, right? Some clues here, and some design surface clues better than others. And so one important hinge that we really went for is temporality, right? That those 3 a.m. recurrences, and we realized that it wasn't just about the 3 a.m. That actually it speaks to a broader point, which is that time series data, which is largely the kind of data that you get off of sensors, isn't valuable just because it has numerical values strung together, right? It's valuable because there's the timestamp associated with those values. And it's that combination that enables a consideration of what might not actually be in the data at all, right? Because people's lives have temporal patterns, right? So for example, John had gone through a process of considering lots of these, right? It's like different temporalities, right? Offer different kinds of hinges. So in John's case, first he looked for duration of sleeping across the night, or the time he lays down in bed, right? All of that you can get from the same data set, but they speak to actually very different things that could be going on. And so there's a churning process of sort of, trying to find the hinge that actually, speaks to something else. And so that's what the first version of DataSense was really trying to do, to sort of help people do that churning faster before they give up on the data wrangling, which is something of a, barrier, right? But again, this is not, this is data processing that actually doesn't have a whole lot to do with math, right? As Anne comments, what makes a good self-tracker is not the ability to do math, it's the ability to think at multiple time scales, right? And these time scales, or these hinges really, point back to a number of different kinds of patterns, right? They point back to sometimes social patterns, sometimes biological, sometimes machinic, right? And John's in particular had to do with the intersection between circadian rhythms and machine rhythms. But we can imagine that, a day of week recurrence, right, something that happens every Thursday, is more likely to be a sort of a social phenomenon than it is about, say, the weather, right? The weather doesn't respond to the work week, as it turns out. But hinges are not just recurrences, even though recurrences tend to be really important. Hinges also have to do with durations, they have to do with notions of the present. So for example, as I wrote this talk, I was wearing a smartwatch, and it had a heart rate monitor, that this too does. And so, that becomes, it shifts the present in some really interesting ways, right? Whereas once I might have taken my pulse every once in a while, right, at a doctor's office, on an exercise machine, now, not only do I just have more data, but I also have data that inserts itself in the briefest moment and sort of expands into kind of the long term, right? And so I might, for example, look at my data on the watch or the activity tracker right now. It might say something like 68 beats a minute, probably a lot bigger since I'm talking. And it might say, a number of steps, 3,000 or whatever it is. And those two things, I mean, this is quite banal in a lot of ways, but those two things are actually two very different notions of the present, right? One is a split time, and one is, sort of a split moment, I should say. The other is sort of an aggregation across a day. And yet they're both strangely now, right? So we've got this very interesting sort of pliable now that stems out of these various sort of material and semiotic qualities of data. And in turn, those nows build up to a decision that I have to make about when to end the tracking, right? Is a week enough? John could, have found something, across a couple of weeks, right? What do you get for 5 years worth of tracking, right? All those are actually very different, and speak to different sorts of social, cultural, physical processes, right? Right, so that's where things start to get pretty tricky, in the sense that, we know from work, from folks like Jeff Bowker, Liesl Giedelman, Marcia Noortje Mars, gosh, she's gonna get mad at me. Right, we know that data's already social, right? That has already been configured in some way from the moment it hits a sensor. And so, when a user sort of uploads data onto DataSense, it's true that we offer, what we're trying to do is offer a more sort of expanded repertoire of possible aggregations. But that's, of course, a social shaping in and of itself, right? We're not trying to do, offer every conceivable mathematical function, right? That's a different kind of a thing. But even when it comes off of something like a smartwatch of a Fitbit, it already has a notion of aggregation in it, right? So, usually these things sample, they're sampling heart rate at most, you can think of it as a second-by-second basis. It sort of varies, but that's how you get your split second. And then when I try to export it, right, off of the service, what I'm getting is minute-by-minute data. And so, right, you're going from 60 to 1. And that's actually a sensible thing to do, right? Second-by-second data, it makes a huge file if you're doing anything more than 24 hours. You're not going to want to ship that around. And there are some reasons why you might want that, but if you are a large company or even a medium-sized or small one, right, you're not going to build for that one obscure case because the cost just doesn't bear out. But there's got to be a method to go from 60 to 1, and that method is based on a guess about its future uses, right? You can see the shaping of this stuff in action, right? So often companies sort of take an average across a minute because that seems reasonable, because it's the go-to place, and I think probably most importantly, it smooths out. Occasionally sensors do spurious things, right? Sometimes they jump for no particular reason, or don't record, and so they're trying to smooth that out. But of course, folks in the QS world are quick to point out that that average is all well and good if what you're doing is looking to measure your exercise. But what if what you're looking to do is use the heart rate as a proxy for stress, right? You might want to take the maximum, right? Because actually, right, your stress will, if it's a fight or flight response, it'll go up and then, sort of go down quite quickly, and So that's a choice, right? It's a choice about what anticipated use looks like, and those choices are the very reasons why QS folks get really invested in debates about deeper access to data, right? And that's precisely because their epistemologies are all about contextual knowledge, right? And companies simply can't do that because they can't anticipate every single tiny context, right? There's a specificity to individual contexts that I think QSers are pointing out. Now, of course, we could sort of talk about space in exactly these same terms, right? I would spare you the details of that, but essentially, there are notions of aggregation that get you from, GPS coordinates and lots of sensor data to something that says this is a thing that happens in a place, right? All of those are sort of decisions that have to be made, and they're social and technical. I think what these various intra-individual aggregations speak to is that we don't just have more data points here. What we've really got is vastly more spatio-temporal dimensions to think with and to aggregate across, right? And it's those dimensions really that are connecting back to lived experience. And yet, that's precisely where these very real uncertainties and sort of disconnects emerge, right? This is where companies have to make guesses that may or in fact not be right, and in fact can't be right for everyone, right? And it's also where self-trackers themselves aren't exactly so clear where the hinge actually goes, right? This is an unknown that they're trying to unravel. And so, which is all to sort of say, one of the things as I mentioned earlier in data sense, one of the things we focused on is just sort of to enable that churning to happen quite quickly. And so you can see here, this is a sort of after you've uploaded some data, sort of where you land. And so you can pull up whatever you've got, sort of throw it in, take it out, throw it in, take it out, to sort of churn through different variables quite quickly. And those sort of tools at the top will switch from sort of a time series to recurrences, to spatial aggregations, to correlation, which also has a temporal aggregation aspect to it, right? So the idea is here you're working, how can we explore as quickly as possible to get to the, but we're not what we're not doing is sort of making a claim about, and this has this clinical significance, and this has, right, because we know we can't do that. Which gets us back to medicine. All right, so the notion of self-tracking as relating to medicine has kind of always been in the background. Let me just check where we are. Crap, all right. So very early in the research, a person who was both a self-tracker and an MD told me, and this is a quote, he said, clinical trials are really great for figuring out the side effects of a drug for the first 500 people. The problem is that you could be number 501 and have a very different reaction. And so for people like this MD, collecting data for yourself, in a sense, is a recognition that we're all, in a sense, number 501 in one way or another, right? At a certain point, if you try to put yourself on, lots and lots of bell curves, you're gonna be an outlier, right? That itself is a kind of a normality. And so for him, there's a relationship to medical practice, but that relationship is about really being more than just an example of what's already known, right? There's a kind of an exploratory element. But in medical circles, of course, this view is far from dominant, particularly in medical research circles, right? Aggregates of personal data, right? So, the medical research community is more or less cottoned on to the idea that wearables are now more or less widely deployed, that there might be some clinical value, some research value, in using using that to actually find out something epidemiologically or what have you. And the way that they think about that prospect is through this notion of data donation, right? So they've got this idea that medical discoveries are much more likely to happen when individual self-trackers sort of donate their data to public health researchers, right? So this is kind of, it's building on a long-standing tradition in medicine that I think we'll probably all recognize. It's the model that gets used in the project on this topic I know best is the Health Data Exploration Project, which is housed at UC San Diego, and that's an effort to facilitate and, in a sense, broaden data donation, right? So you have, but embedded within that is a formulation, really, that assumes a really very high amount of institutional control over how these aggregations are going to happen, right? And that control is really built in also to the technical infrastructures that are emerging to support this stuff. So two examples of what those infrastructures try to do. First, there are now both for-profit and nonprofit entities that exist to create standardized clinical definitions of data off of consumer devices, right? So if you parse, activity, accelerometer data, the data that underlies the Fitbit, right, in a certain way across a certain amount of time, and it looks like X, right, you have a measurement of gait, right, a measurement of walking, right? And so, there's a lot of work to try to figure out essentially how these things are speaking to a medical world. And that's being defined both for care applications, right, and also for research applications. And these are organizations that actually do hold the door open for communicating with patients in various ways, and actually are very keen on involving patients in this clinical definition, right? So they will say things like, of course, really switched on patients actually have a lot to say about this stuff, right? They kind of do talk the participatory talk and walk it to a certain extent. But really the goal here is to be able to remove that measurement from any particular context, right, to enable it to circulate around. Right. The second infrastructure that's sort of developing here is the infrastructure that's required to literally move data from a tracking device to a set of medical researchers, which is a non-trivial problem, right? We have this, particularly in the social sciences, I think we have this imagination that data just flows, right? No, it really doesn't. Getting this stuff out of Fitbits, out of smartwatches, out of whatever it is no joke, and doing it for medical research is even thornier, right? So there are companies like Fitabase, Apple, you might know, developed their research kit, which is essentially about brokering relationships with research subjects and researchers, right? So this is a brokering relationship, but it's not data broker in the sense you might think about it on the web, where your web traffic gets bought and sold, right? This is not that. This is about, how you handle permissioning, how you sort of make those flows secure in a way that would be commensurate with medical research, right? All of that stuff. But it's notable here that in Apple Research Kit you have to show Apple your IRB before they'll let you use, as a researcher, before they'll let you use the kit. And of course QS folks have said, well, we don't have those, right? So there's some assumptions here that are happening. And there are assumptions that are really all about getting to large N ways of knowing, right? The premise here is that it's the medical researchers and not the data havers, right? The data subjects, which is how Helen Nissenbaum talks about them. That it's the researchers, not the data subjects, that stand a chance of getting additional meaning from the process of aggregation. And that assumption, I think, really comes at the expense of erasing from meaning making that such as the moments that John had, right? His 3 a.m. is not going to show up in these large N aggregations, right? Which I'm not saying are inherently problematic in some way, right? But I'm saying that there's a disconnect, and there's also real value in that 3 a.m., right? And it might very well be a clinical value. It might be something that in fact is a much broader issue and we just don't know it yet, right? So then we started to ask, okay, well, what infrastructure design strategies then would take seriously, John's 3 a.m. problem, right? If we have a path that really is starting to get defined around, wrangling data into large N ways of knowing, right? What would be, what would be the opposite, right? What would be the one that took, the sort of the N of 1 ways of knowing more seriously? N of 1 being sort of how quantified self people talk about, their research practice in a sense. And so then we sort of asked, well, what do those aggregations even mean, right? To whom might aggregations, cross-population aggregations, to whom might that be meaningful if people are also doing basically individual work? So the design question really became then, how do you essentially represent the 500 when your audience thinks of themselves as number 501 in a way? So then we went back to the ethnography and sort of said, okay, where are quantified self people actually talking about each other's data, and how are they talking about each other's data? And so one of the things we noticed, hold on, is that, there is a very good reason why folks actually get together and face-to-face and online to talk, right? And they are, in fact, interested. And the way that they're interested in others' data is either by using it as points of comparison, a resource for triangulation, but what they're not trying to do is they're not trying to attempt a final say over what is and isn't healthy, right? They're not trying to discover that in some way. So an example of how this works is, when John tells a story at a community event, others might look at what he's done and test whether it's true for them too, right? In my own QS group in Portland, we had this remarkable moment where someone was complaining that the algorithm that was used by his sleep sensing device really must be off, because there's just no way a person can get there was no way he was able to get a score below 98% sleep quality, whatever 98% sleep quality actually means, but right, there's no way he was able to do that, and so we thought the machine was off, and so somebody raised their hand and said, well, actually, you can get below 98%, right? I get 70 most nights. And so there's a comparison happening here, but it's a comparison across people that's being used to learn something about the instrument, or about instrument calibration, right? Not, a comparison that uses standardized, calibrated instruments to learn something about people, right? So we're kind of flipping things around here. And so, through paying attention to encounters like this, we said, all right, well, there might actually be room for kind of a classical population-based histogram within the situating work of paraclinical practice, right? That part of the paraclinical here is situating oneself, and that is social, right? I'm going to give you this is a prototype version of it, so the histogram does not make sense currently, but the idea is we're experimenting with this idea of sort of being able to opt in to anonymous aggregations, right, of various kinds, right? So oh wow, that really didn't render. The idea here is that you can sort of, users can set their data either to be totally private by default, available for anonymous aggregation, or in fact direct sharing. So if, I was working with somebody directly, they needed to see the full data set, I could just sort of hand it off. And this is really about trying to figure out what a peer-to-peer relationship would look like as opposed to an expert layperson. Right, so here users can only view aggregate, so it gets sort of spat out. You sort of have a little workflow and it gets spat out in the corner there as a kind of a query. And you can only do that, you can only query that anonymous data if you yourself have contributed, right, in some way, right? In a sense that you've got to be, the users have to be a participant in order to be, an analyst as well. The other thing we built into this is the idea that the system shares the results of that query back with others who have constituted that pool, right? So that other people have visibility into the kinds of questions that actually their data can start to answer, right? A little bit, in the same vein, but different from that kind of back and forth that we see in live QS meetings, right? So what we're trying to do really is sort of reverse the concept of data donation, in that using John or Anne's data here really also requires recognizing them as, not just data subjects, but also knowledge producers at the same time. Right? A data scientist can't just hide in the corner, sort of making their aggregations and calculations, and where the data subjects don't even know what's going on. So in that sense, we probably won't ever become a tool for kind of large N research. But what we are exploring, and it's not clear where this will go yet, is we're exploring whether this might in fact be a viable tool for community-based participatory research, right? Research where the ethos is where participants' view about what their data says matters as much as what the researcher believes it says, right? But again, you can see the back and forth that's happening here. The technical decisions that we've had to make here sort of makes me take a step back and say, well, what kinds of relations are we really proposing? The politics, in a sense, are clear enough, right? In the sense that, we can see, and when we're starting to test how patient movements, environmental health groups, right, sort of folks in that area might want to use something like this to not just figure out what's going on with them individually, but then also, flip into a more general claim that, hey, this is not just me, or we're not crazy here, and start to have a conversation with the relevant institutions at hand. At an epistemological level, perhaps the situation is a little less clear. Right, this is an encounter, in a way, with the very epistemics that our user base is also seeking a critical distance from, right? They're number 501, and yet think with the first 500. And so that's a real tension, right? It's a philosophical tension that can't simply be resolved through technical means, and yet the technology has to address the tension in some way. Right, so an example of this is this problem, which is sort of defining what data can successfully be pooled with what other data. And so, we have this issue of, the system needs to know what data is the same. And what data is the same is non-trivial, right? There are plenty of instances like sleep quality, where you might upload data into a system. This is a screenshot of the data upload flow, and define it as sleep quality, but it might be on different scales. It might be, textual definition as opposed to numerical, right? There are a lot of ways you can measure sleep quality, as it turns out. And so then the question becomes, well, if two people who have been using sleep quality in some way, and that's comparable, right, if you're looking at it at a human level, but not comparable at a database level, right, what do you do? And the answer is we don't actually know. The broader interdisciplinary discussions of big data, of course, resolve this through metadata, right? Sort of like basically making the handoff matching. It says this matches to that, right? And the issue I have is that, too much metadata, in effect, imagines a kind of world of infinite commensurability, right? And that's not what we're trying to build, right? This is not a large N world, at least data senses. And, what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a place where people can learn from one another, right? And in a sense, make space for productive incommensurability. So, that sort of gives you a flavor of the kind of the challenges that arise when you sort of try to hold attention together, in the technical system. I'll just say a couple more words about where QS is headed, and then I'll wrap things up. So one, I think our method for kind of working around this problem, is continuing to be engaged with the social relations that in a sense manage the tension, right, between sort of large N and N of 1. And there are a number of dialogues that are now occurring where, and we can also see shifts in those dialogues happening. So one place these conversations between clinical knowledge and self-tracking knowledge is happening is in this symposium that's been happening across the last 3 years called QS Public Health Symposium. Right? So this is an event that's been run for the last 3 years. It's hosted by Quantified Self Labs, organized by QS Labs, sponsored by Robert Wood Johnson, which is a large American foundation that funds health research projects. And also, I think quite notably, takes place adjacent to the Health Data Exploration meeting. So in that meeting, that project you might recall has everything to do with data donation. So this symposium, normally when there's a QS conference, it's really centered around individual self-trackers talking about what they did. There's some of that, but really this event is all about hosting a dialogue between those self-trackers on various and self-trackers specifically as knowledge producers, clinical researchers, and infrastructure builders, right? And so the shift in the terms of discussion have been fairly remarkable, right? The first year, there was lots of complaints from the medical world that consumer device data is not clinically legible, and therefore it's bad data to be donated, right? The big problem is that industry people need to make their data more clinically relevant. The second year, we heard much more from clinicians who did self-tracking themselves. And one reason they did that was to try to understand what it's like to be on the receiving end of monitoring, right? And we also heard from patients who said, you know what, I'm now on a medical research advisory board, and this is the first time ever I have not been treated as the token patient, right? So you're starting to see signs of shifts here. By the third meeting, we heard from university-based medical research, like folks in medical schools, making assertions that self-tracking might turn the evidence pyramid on its head, and that the individual case study actually could be transformed in ways that might elicit better understanding than the current gold standard of randomized controlled trials, right? And of course, one result has been that there is now an effort to build a new scientific journal specifically devoted to N of 1 studies, right? So you're starting to get these really interesting entanglements and encounters, right? Right, so I certainly won't claim that this particular meeting, right, this is just one corner of a very, very large institutional professional world, but those shifts I think are pretty significant. And yet it's also significant that it happened where a large portion of that very same group, literally the day before or the next day, also went off to a group of meetings about data donation, right? And it's sort of doing it sort of in a sense the usual way, right? So this is not oppositional, although I do see epistemological tensions, but there's a relationship and a distinction, and they're kind of held in tension, I suppose you could say. Right, so wrapping up now, I began by talking, with this pretty sharp but also coarse distinction between different styles of thought that seek to make large-scale generalizable claims through big data versus those that seek to use rich data sets to define and resolve a context-specific problem. And I hope I've convinced you that distinction is no longer as sharp as it might at first seem, right? That there are these new arenas now of engagement that are forming in much more complicated ways than, a distinction between grounds up and tops down or panoptical versus situated. Right, there are these new kind of hybrids and encounters really emerging. We also have, these knowledge formations that are happening in kind of a parallel dialogue, but I also don't want to leave you thinking that this isn't necessarily always 1,000 flowers flourishing, right? We could very well find ourselves in a situation down the line where things get a little bit more pointed and contested, right? Particularly should, patient groups, environmental justice folks, those types of communities start making broader claims about what they found in their own data. And those might be claims that might not, ever seek to generalize widely, sort of in a once and for all, fundamental principles way, but also claims about something that needs to be done beyond individual action, right, which is kind of where self-trackers operate now. We might, in fact, find ourselves in a relationship between, of contestation, right, of struggle. But for now, things are emerging, right? And I think that lets us sort of return, again to Kitchen's call for, a very real discussion about critical reflexivity, right, situated reflexivity that new big data systems make possible, or make possible in new ways. And to that I would add that, Kitchen's looking for these discussions to take place in scientific institutions. And yet the case of QS speaks to the possibility that instead it might be found in the encounters between science and paraclinical practice, right? The parts of society that really value science enough to demand that it act differently.